Um, we are going to continue this evening. I also want to remind you, we mentioned that 50-50 draw, but I also want to remind you about our presenting sponsor, who I have not mentioned in a little while, Fisher and Paykel. Please take a moment at the end of this conference to look up Fisher and Paykel and all our sponsors, because without them, again, as I said, this event wouldn't be happening. And I can already see how useful, wonderful this event is. So a little bit of, shoot them a little bit of your attention, and that'll be a wonderful thing that you can do for our sponsors today. All right, we are going to continue now with our next speaker. So I will let me introduce it very properly here. We've just talked about, if I recap the day so far, we've talked about mental health with youth. We've talked about personal story of mental health. We've talked about mental health in the workplace. Next up, I am going to introduce you to a psychotherapist, a motivational speaker and author, Andrea Boea. And Andrea has 20 years of experience in the mental health field and is going to be talking about something we just alluded to with Debbie about if you have that, if you are going through mental health distress yourself, we're going to talk about, or Andrea is going to talk about how to sort of recognize and deal with it. And Andrea's talk is called Understanding Your Trauma. So please welcome Andrea Boea. Hi, Andrea.
Ali, thank you so much. This has been an incredible morning. Thank you from that moving presentation, and thank you so much, Eric, for sharing your story at the front end. That was just so impactful, and the awareness that Andy also brought around addiction. And Debbie, thank you so much. Hats on. This is an incredible initiative. Everyone on the line, thank you so much for showing up for yourself in such an incredible way this morning and for such an important conversation. I'm going to start in by telling you a story, and hopefully this will broaden the spec on understanding trauma. When I was a baby, before I had the ability to speak, I struggled with an illness that in fact overwhelmed my body. And in reality, that was my first experience of trauma before I had this conscious awareness of what trauma is. And my grandmother would tell me the story, and my aunts would say that I didn't have the ability to communicate in the way that a child or a baby would. Whenever a child or a baby needs to ask for something, they will cry. I'm wet, I'm hungry. I didn't have that ability because the illness that I struggled with robbed me of my audible voice. So I would be told that whenever I had a need, I would have a sound like, so unless someone was paying attention to me in an intentional way, my needs would have gone unmet. In my life, I was so fortunate, and I'm forever grateful that I had a grandmother who somehow was able to look beyond the illness or the trauma that I was experiencing that time and be intentionally present enough to hear what I was saying when I didn't have the voice to say it. I want to invite you to broaden the spec on trauma today in the way that we understand trauma, that we have all been through something, all of us, but not all of us have been traumatized by what we've been through. And if we have been traumatized, that is, if this experience has been overwhelming enough to impact our nervous system in a negative way, as in a shutdown, for example, and the messaging or the belief system that we then have about ourselves that is negatively laden, it's important to know. And by the end of this presentation, I'll bring it around full circle of how this trauma in my life, before I had the conscious awareness of what trauma was, and how the response to that trauma in my environment really has shaped who I've become today. So I'm going to pull up this slides for you to move you along in this presentation. There we go. So I want you to know that a big part of understanding trauma, understanding the trauma that you might have experienced or anyone else that you know might have experienced, has so much to do with understanding the brain. I'm going to demonstrate to you really quickly, and if you are looking on, if you could follow through with me, because it might help you. Dr. Dan Siegel came up with what he calls the hand model of the brain. And for most of us, we understand that the brain is a pretty complex organ. The good news is that if you understand the brain enough, it is helpful to then understand how trauma impacts our life. So if you could hold up one hand like so with me. And if you pay attention to this part of your hand, this is the brainstem part of your hand, so in the back of the head, proper. And then this part in the middle, as simplifying, is the emotional storage of our past, so the limbic system. But if you remember the emotional storage of our past, that's good enough. Then you will see the four fingers that wrap over. This is the frontal lobe that is meant to regulate the emotional storage of our past. Here's the reality. Whenever we have been through anything traumatic in the past, that unresolved, if it's not attended to and healed, is stored here in our brain. If you look at this as a process for information, when we are triggered, for example, go through this process flow and hits this part of our brain first before it gets to this part. So the frontal lobe proper, again, is the logical thinking center, the part of us that is able to be aware of the world around us and how we are impacted, the part of us that is able to know I'm being triggered right now, and that trigger is asking me to lean inwards as opposed to outwards, reacting outward. And so this part of the brain, it comes alive almost like a computer system, an 1/8 to a 1/12 of a second. But this part of the brain comes online 2 to 3 seconds later. Here, I want you to imagine that in between the limbic system, emotional storage of your past, and the frontal lobe is awareness. If I'm aware that the trauma of my past is being triggered and my lid starts to open, then I'm able to respond as opposed to react. And my responding is what helps me to move into the path of healing. I want you to know that whenever all of us are triggered by what we don't know, and I'm going to explain to you in a minute, because this part of us is the subconscious part, so it's not readily available in terms of conscious awareness. So whenever we are triggered, this part comes alive first. And if I have the awareness necessary, understanding the brain, I could at least bring on one bar. One bar, speaking out aloud. I'm being triggered right now. That's awareness. One bar, I could reach out to my safe space. Another bar. It doesn't mean the requirement is not perfection. So all bars don't need to be on, if at least one. We call that integration. And as I move through these slides, I would help you to understand what that integration might look like. Many clients that I work with do this often. So they know that they are being triggered, raising the hand, doing the hand model, hand model of the brain helps them now to center in a way to look inward as opposed to reacting outward. So I want you to know, like myself and yourself, everyone, and everything. So the trauma that we've been through itself has a story and has an important voice, has a voice with an important story to tell. And as Debbie was explaining just really well just now, the story that is within all of us, might I say, deserve to be heard. And what that takes from those who are around us and from us ourselves is to slow down long enough to listen to the voice. That might be if you had a story similar to mine. Many of us have been rendered silenced because of the trauma that we've been through. And so know that that silence has a voice, and it is important for that voice to be heard if we slow down to listen to ourselves and to listen to those in our environment. It makes the world of a difference. So here's the reality. Just about 10% of our behavior on a daily basis, decision making, change happens within our conscious awareness. The other about 90%, so again, 10% conscious awareness. The other 90% is in that subconscious part of our brain. So the call from a reflection, just really trumpeting the focus today. Reflection calls us to go beneath the surface and to pay attention to what is beneath the surface. And I will show you in a minute how our hearts are so incredibly in love with us that our lives, in terms of the repeated patterns or triggers that we all experience, is one way that our heart is working on our behalf to bring up to consciousness what is subconscious. And so the next time that you are triggered, it's a vast different perspective, I know, but I want you to peer in with this awareness, this reflection awareness, that this is calling you to pay attention to what is subconscious as opposed to reacting out of the trigger. That means slow down. So the more we pay attention to what is subconscious trauma, it is the more it comes to consciousness. So now instead of 90, this might be 30 and this is 70. So the more we work on becoming aware of what is subconscious, the more we can respond out of consciousness, the logical coping part of our brain. So I brought up this slide to show you the face of trauma. So trauma could be a young person, as I've just explained. It could be the baby in me. It could be the older elderly person. It could be the professional at work, because all of us have parts in us that is we show up and we do what we do. So none of us are wholly traumatized or wholly broken, so to speak. There are parts of us that have been impacted by the overwhelming experiences of the past that went beyond our capacity to cope at the time, emotionally, for the most part. So for most of us, that part has stayed less than developed. But then the other parts of us, so for example, if you think you wake up and you breathe and you grow 1 year older, but if that emotional part of yourself is nurtured, attended to, healed, then it stays younger, for example. So you might be seeing someone who's amazing professional leader in their intellectual capacity, but emotionally that person might still be 10 because at 10, the trauma occurred and healing was not attended to, or the right resources wasn't available. There wasn't someone to, for example, hear the story and participate in that person's healing. And so that emotional part could be just about 10. And whenever that person is triggered, that him or her will respond out of that part or react. The right understanding is that whenever I'm triggered, I'm going to go beneath the surface and bring on awareness so I could show up and heal that part. So again, if in good understanding, trauma is not so much what happened, but what we internalize and have held in our subconscious because of what happened. And that subconscious part of us comes up to bear whenever we are triggered in a familiar situation now, like the traumatic experience then. So the reality of trauma is that there is an experience of trauma. Again, the wound is internalized and is stored in our subconscious beneath the surface. This chart on the right, on my screen at least, is showing an example or a depiction of what happens. If there is a lack of awareness, then what is stored subconsciously in your brain then show up in your behavior. So the unresolved. When we introduce awareness, then Responding, which is the pathway to healing from awareness, becomes the journey for most of us. And the reality is, because trauma was stored in the subconscious part of our brain, most of us unwittingly react out of that part. So without intention, react. And so that's why conversations like these today are so incredibly important, because awareness is the key to healing. So I want you to know that it is possible to heal. It is possible to heal. I want you to just echo that in your mind. It is possible to heal. It is possible for me to heal. It is possible for you to heal. It is possible for everyone who's been traumatized to actually start that journey, the path of healing. Remember, we can't rewind the clock to the past to change what has happened, but we can heal what was internalized because of what happened in the past. So remember, whatever was stored subconsciously, the wound that was stored from the past is showing up now, inviting us to heal when we are triggered. So we can heal what was internalized, the belief system that was internalized, the wound that was internalized because of what we've experienced. Here is a quote that I trumpet in the work that I do. What happens next determine who we become. It is not so much what happened in the past, but what happens next that determines who we become. I tell you about the story of my grandmother. Yes, what happened is that I had a traumatizing illness that robbed me of my voice even before I was able to speak. But because my grandmother showed up and became a voice for the voicelessness in me, then she truly participated in who I became in such an incredible way. And I am who I am today, in part, in a big way, because she showed up for me in such a way to meet my need that I was unable to give a voice to. So I want you to know again that trauma is revealed through triggers and our awareness of those triggers. So till today, whenever I'm triggered or I'm hurt, I slip back automatically into withdraw silence. When I bring on one bar of awareness, I'm aware that that is the trauma part of me yet healing and is calling me to pay attention. When I pay attention to that part of me, I show up to the safe people and express, I am feeling, I need. So paying attention to the awareness when we're triggered is pivotal. So trauma is healed through compassionate awareness. Many of us, it's like if, for example, I think there's an example that was being used. If eating, for example, disorder or addiction is there, I go again. I just did it again. The judgment, whatever we judge, and hold on to it this way, whatever we judge, we get stuck with. It recreates more of itself. So when we judge ourselves, we feel worse about ourselves and we slip back into coping from the unresolved part. So the invitation is to show up with compassion, that I'm aware that I've just gone back in the path that I don't want to. I show up now with awareness and say, okay, I'm going to take one step at a time. And Andy did such a great job saying, I'm going to make a 5-minute promise to myself. I'm going to take one small action to lead me in the direction that I want to go. If you're a service provider, this compassionate awareness with trauma-informed intervention. So it's important to understand how trauma has impacted us individually and collectively, and how that has been stored in the subconscious part of our brain, and that the behavior of that person doesn't truly define them. They are really, in fact, victim of the unawareness that exists about what is stored subconsciously. So part of our job as service provider is to support those that we're privileged to work with, to bring awareness about what is stored. And part of what brings awareness about what is stored is by how we are triggered. So the wisdom in our triggers, pattern, and mental health concerns, because mental health concern often is an adaptation. It's a way that was developed from a young age sometimes, and again, in part, not fully, in part to cope with. So because this trauma was overwhelming and there wasn't the right support existing, for example, I shut down. And my nervous system has practiced shutting down whenever I'm triggered. Ultimately, that becomes overwhelming to my nervous system and could show up in anxiety symptoms or depression symptoms. So if we track back on the trauma that is stored and is fueling this mental health concern or this pattern of behavior choices in relationship or trigger, if we now pay attention to what is being revealed to the trigger, we can get to the root of the matter and begin the healing process in a sustainable way. So the repeated patterns in our life, relationship, mental health, or choices are our greatest awareness teacher. And it's calling us to compassion, parking the judgment. The things that trigger you the most, I want you to know, hold the greatest information about what needs to heal beneath the surface. So for example, someone struggles with eating and might have been violated in the past, and food became the friend. It's important to show up and acknowledge that the benefit there is that whenever I call on food, it never says no. It shows up, it soothes me, it's been a friend. If we show up just on the surface, and so away from the hand model, just from the surface and say, don't eat, that's judgment. If we show up beneath the surface and be curious about the trauma that is driving this coping, then we can bring light to the cost and the benefit with compassion and then lead that individual to healing. Because ultimately, we will then explore alternative to the soothing, the healing that is needed in that moment without the cost. So awareness is healing. When we are open to becoming more aware, when we are triggered here and now, knowing that the internalized wound from the past is activated beneath the surface. I like to say trauma is like an encasement within, and whenever we're triggered, it explodes. With awareness, we will contain that explosion from a respond and compassion and awareness. So whether as a clinician, I'm supporting someone to go to that place of the trauma to open safely for the purpose of healing, or whether that person is triggered in the moment and then there's an explosion of the trauma, awareness, compassionate awareness works the same. So when we are aware and compassionate to say, right, I'm being triggered right now. Be curious about what that trigger is drawing your attention to beneath the surface. Then we show up differently in our behavior. So that's the awareness is healing. It really looks at what's happening in the mind and brain, and then healing in the body. Without awareness, whatever is happening in the subconscious is repeated in our lives and then makes more the trauma more solid or deepened. So again, I can't say enough how awareness and compassion is important. So as we are given the opportunity to show up in this great space and with those in our community, commit to be in a safe space and to practice compassionate awareness. Listen to the story, the important story that is in the heart of that person. And from listening to that important story, it could be one amazing step towards healing. So I invite you to slow down and show up. Show up for what matters the most. Show up for yourself, show up for your heart. Become more aware what's stored in your heart. Show up for someone else. Be a safe space. Be curious and be compassionate. Make a commitment to do the inner work. The inner work, I say it this way, instruction without relationship to the heart of the matter. What's inside often unwittingly leads to oppression, further oppression, or further trauma. So make a commitment to be curious and compassionate about what's beneath the surface and do the inner work. Give attention to what's beneath the surface. So here is the full circle of my story. See the trauma in the midst. See the treasure in the midst of your trauma. And I use those letters that are somewhat reflective or fuzzy intentionally. Most of us, when we rise up in awareness, would say, I would never choose that trauma experience. And that's me. I don't know. If I had the chance to rewind the clock, I wouldn't choose that trauma experience. What I wouldn't give up for the world is the treasure that I found in that trauma experience, and particularly because of how my grandmother responded to me in healing. Today, I have an incredible ability to hear the voice of silence because I know intricately what it means or what it meant then to be silenced. And so when I show up as a psychotherapist, that's the gift that I bring to those that I serve. I hear the voice of silence. Many, many times during my day and my work, I will say something like this: it sounds like. And then that person will come back saying, right, yes, exactly. And I collaborate with that person in bringing the subconscious to consciousness that was before silenced. Because I know what it means to have been silenced, I now have the gift of listening to the voice that has been silenced. I want you to think in your own life, what is, and it's important to think about this in really good context and go slow as you consider this. What is the treasure in the midst of the trauma experience that you or those around you might have experienced? As I listened to Eric this morning, this was trumpeted so well. This trauma experience in family that none of us would embrace willingly has matriculated in such a powerful passion and expression of service. That's a reality for most of us when we slow down with awareness to find the treasure in our trauma. So I invite you today to reflect with hope. It is possible to heal from the wounds that you have internalized from the trauma experience while none of us are able to rewind the clock. How do you do that? Honor your heart. Pay attention to your heart with awareness, compassion, and be mindful. Practice the strategies of mindfulness. Show up ever so often and breathe deeply and pay attention to the awareness of how that feels in your body. When we pay attention to the mechanism of how we react or respond triggered and feel into what we're experiencing, it makes a difference. Be open where you are safe. Reach out. Challenge the culture of silence. Show up for someone and invite them into the safe space of telling their story. Share your story with safe people. And I describe safe people this way: someone who's able to hear your story, someone who's able to hold your heart, and someone who's able to participate in your healing. So redefine who is your safe support circle. It's important for all of us to have that. Mother was that for me, my grandmother. I called her mother when I was a baby. And because I had that, now I get to show up out of the strength of that trauma experience, the treasure. Practice healing in small steps. So take small steps and be kind to yourself. Take small steps. Exercise. The E is exercise and eat well. Much of what happens in our brain first happens in our gut. There are foods out there that are called brain foods, for example. Look them up and introduce more of them into your diet, because we power our brain by what we eat and how we participate in regulating our nervous system. And then call your attention to be self-compassionate. There are much research that has been done on trauma and how it impacts our life. And one of the top comeback is compassion is what heals trauma. Show up for yourself in the belief system that you've held, because one of the first things that goes for most of us when we've been traumatized is our self-identity. We show up, it's my fault, I'm not good enough, I'm not lovable, and then behave out of that belief system. So I want you to say with me, showing up in compassion in this moment: I am enough. I am worthy. I am lovable. I deserve a heart that is healed. I deserve to heal from the inside out, from the inside out. I deserve to heal from any wound that I've carried and relive. I invite myself to compassionate awareness. I deserve to experience all that is possible for myself and in my community. I'm going to show up for me. I'm going to honor my heart, and I'm going to also show up for someone else. I end here, one moment at a time, one person at a time, one generation at a time. And I believe from all of the presentations today, this is being trumpeted so well. It is possible. It is possible to heal what you've internalized as a result of the trauma that you've been through, from compassionate awareness and the supportive environment that you deserve. Reach out when you need to, and reach out to someone else along the way.
Andrea, thank you so much. Thank you so much. It's such an inspirational story. I like that you come full circle on that, because the entire time you were talking, I said, how incredible that someone who was born without the ability to speak, that is their trauma, is now a motivational speaker and is now someone who helps heal others as a psychotherapist. So it's really interesting to hear what you're talking about. And there's comments coming in saying that that was an awesome speech. What you're talking about is so deeply personal that I wasn't sure if there would be questions. These seem like things that are deeply, deeply held. But I know absolutely that this is very, very beneficial. As somebody who's had experience, living with somebody who had borderline personality disorder, and I have more knowledge about that than most human beings should, who don't have a medical degree. I connected with so much of what you said, and there's so much value in everything you said. Thank you so much.
Welcome.
Let's take some time to digest what you heard. We're going to have our last health break. We have 2 health breaks. This is number 2. Oh, where can we get your book and the affirmation, is a question from Nicole. Andrea, just before we let you go.
Yes, so the books are on Amazon, and The Heart of a Good Thing and Legacy Moments are both on Amazon.
Great. Okay, thank you so much. Let's take a 15-minute health break. I'm going to focus on the E in hope that Andrea mentioned. I'm going to eat something good for my stomach. And you know what? I might even do some sit-ups, maybe 20 sit-ups. I'm going to have to remove this shirt because the buttons will burst on this shirt if I try to do a sit-up in this thing. I'm starting here, Andrea, inspired by you. I'm going to do some exercise right now. You're free to obviously do whatever you like, but I think as we've had these particularly inspirational speakers talk about doing good things for ourselves, I hope you'll do something good for yourself in the next 15 minutes. I say 11:45. We'll make it 11:45. We'll come back. We have 2 more phenomenal speakers who will again have so much beneficial and encouraging and inspirational stuff to talk about. Us really great resources. In the meantime, you can also look up our sponsors, without whom this event would not be possible. They will be scrolling across during our break, but we will see you back at 11:45.